Picture this. Berlin, January 1945, and the air raid sirens are screaming across the city for the third time in just 24 hours. But down in the Reich Chancellery bunker, Adolf Hitler barely even glances up from the map spread out in front of him. Up above, searchlights are cutting through empty skies, their beams finding absolutely nothing except the smoke still rising from last night's attack. The anti-aircraft guns fire off a few rounds here and there, but the crews already know it's pointless. Those American bombers are cruising at 28,000 feet, way beyond the reach of what little ammunition they have left. And the Luftwaffe fighters that could maybe stop them? They're sitting on runways 300 miles away with bone-dry fuel tanks, their pilots either dead or so green they wouldn't stand a chance anyway. Hitler's hands are trembling as he pushes wooden blocks around the map, moving armies that don't exist anymore, at least not at anything close to the strength those little blocks suggest. When an aide walks in with the latest damage report from the bombing, Hitler just waves him away without even looking at it. "Where is Göring?" he asks, his voice tight and strained. "Where is the Luftwaffe that was supposed to turn our cities into fortresses?" Nobody answers because everybody in that stale bunker air knows the truth. The Luftwaffe is gone. The air defenses are finished. German cities are sitting naked under Allied bombers that come day and night in formations so massive they literally darken the sky, dropping their payloads with complete impunity. And Hitler, the man who once stood before crowds and promised that no enemy bomber would ever reach Berlin, now lives underground, surrounded by concrete walls and an even thicker wall of denial. Here's the thing, though. This collapse didn't happen overnight. It was a slow, grinding disintegration that Hitler watched happen, refused to believe was happening, raged against, and ultimately couldn't stop, even though his own decisions made it worse at almost every single turn. Go back to early 1942, when British bombers started showing up over German cities in numbers that actually mattered. Hitler's confidence in the Luftwaffe was still rock solid. Hermann Göring, his chosen successor and the commander of the entire German Air Force, had promised the Führer that the Reich's defenses were absolutely impenetrable. Göring had even boasted back in 1939 that if a single enemy bomb fell on Berlin, people could call him Meyer, using a common Jewish surname to show just how certain he was. By 1942, Berliners were grimly joking that maybe they should start calling the Reich Marshal Meyer after all. But Hitler still believed in the system Göring had built, and to be fair, that system was genuinely formidable at the time. Germany had ringed its cities with anti-aircraft batteries, organized sophisticated civil defense networks, and maintained a whole force of night fighters equipped with radar technology. Those defenses made British Bomber Command pay a terrible price. During the 1943 Battle of the Ruhr, RAF losses sometimes hit 5% per raid, which is absolutely devastating when you're talking about heavy bombers with 7-man crews. Over Hamburg that summer, the bombers came night after night, and the German flak crews and night fighters made them pay in burning Lancasters tumbling from the sky like falling stars. But Hamburg burned too. 40,000 civilians died in the firestorm that consumed the city. And when Hitler got those reports, witnesses later said he seemed way more concerned with the failure to stop the raids than with all those dead civilians. Why weren't they intercepted? He demanded at a military conference in August 1943, his voice getting louder and angrier. "We have fighters. We have flak. Why do they reach their targets?" The answer was actually pretty complex, but Hitler always preferred simple explanations that let him blame someone. The British were using new tactics, dropping strips of aluminum foil called window that completely blinded German radar systems. They were coming in streams of 600 or 700 aircraft at a time, just overwhelming defenses that were designed to handle much smaller formations. They were learning to concentrate their attacks in ways that created firestorms exceeding anything the Germans had prepared for. But Hitler heard all these explanations as nothing but excuses. In his mind, the Luftwaffe was failing because its commanders lacked willpower, not because the enemy had actually achieved technical and tactical superiority. Albert Speer, the armaments minister who spent more time with Hitler than almost anyone during those final years, later wrote about the Führer's relationship with reality during this period. He had this extraordinary ability, Speer recalled, to hear only what confirmed what he already believed. Reports of successful interceptions would get him animated and energized for hours. Reports of cities burning despite all their defenses would get dismissed as defeatism or blamed on incompetence. When Hamburg's police president reported that the city had suffered catastrophic damage and genuinely could not endure another attack of that magnitude, Hitler's response was to order that no more pessimistic reports should reach him at all. He didn't want the problem solved. He wanted it to not exist in the first place. But the problem just kept getting worse. In late 1943 and early 1944, the Americans joined the British in the systematic destruction of German cities, and they brought a whole new challenge that Hitler's air defenses simply could not meet. The Americans flew by day in formations of 500 or 600 heavy bombers, and each formation was protected by its own massive defensive firepower. The B-17 Flying Fortress earned that name honestly. A single bomber carried 13 machine guns and could absorb tremendous damage before going down. A formation of several hundred flying in tight defensive boxes created an absolute wall of fire that German fighters attacked at their own peril. Adolf Galland, the young and genuinely capable general who commanded Germany's fighter forces, understood exactly what was needed. The Luftwaffe needed to concentrate its fighters, attack in overwhelming numbers, and accept heavy losses to break up those American formations before they reached their targets. But this strategy required more fighters, better training programs, and above all, fuel. Lots of fuel. It also required time to build up forces, which meant allowing some American raids to go completely unopposed while fighters were held back for decisive, knockout blows. Hitler rejected this approach completely. Every bomber that reaches Germany is a failure, he told Galland in a heated conference. I will not permit our fighters to sit idle while American bombs fall on German workers. He demanded that every single raid be opposed, that every fighter be committed, that the Luftwaffe demonstrate its presence even when that presence was way too weak to actually affect the outcome. Galland tried to explain that this approach guaranteed defeat in detail, that spreading forces thin meant every raid would be opposed weakly rather than some raids being opposed decisively enough to actually matter. Hitler didn't want to hear it, not one word. Meanwhile, the relationship between Hitler and Göring had started to decay in a really ugly way. For years, Göring had been Hitler's closest confidant, this jovial, corpulent Reich Marshal who presided over the Luftwaffe like it was his personal kingdom. But as the air war turned against Germany, Göring's presence at Hitler's headquarters became less and less frequent. He retreated to his estate at Karen Hall, surrounded by his massive collection of looted art, indulging in morphine and his own version of denial. Hitler's comments about Göring grew increasingly bitter and harsh. The Reich Marshal has become lazy and incompetent, he told Speer in late 1943. He spends his time playing with his toys while the Luftwaffe falls apart around him. Yet Hitler didn't remove Göring or fundamentally restructure the Luftwaffe's command, and here's why. To do so would be to admit that his judgment in appointing Göring had been wrong, that his closest comrade from the early days of the Nazi movement had failed him. Instead, Hitler began bypassing Göring entirely, issuing orders directly to subordinate commanders, which created massive confusion and resentment throughout the entire Air Force chain of command. Galland found himself receiving contradictory orders from Hitler, from Göring, and from various staff officers, none of whom were coordinating with each other at all. The crisis came to an absolute head in February 1944 during what American airmen called Big Week. The U.S. 8th Air Force, now fielding over 1,000 heavy bombers, launched this coordinated campaign against German aircraft production facilities. The raids came day after day, each one protected by increasing numbers of long-range fighters. The P-51 Mustang had entered service, and this was a game-changer, a fighter with the range to escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back, and the performance to outfight even the best German interceptors. The Luftwaffe rose to meet these raids and was absolutely shattered in the process. In just 6 days of intense combat, German fighter forces lost over 300 pilots killed or seriously wounded. These weren't the inexperienced novices who could be quickly replaced with another training class. These were the veterans, the men with 20 or 30 or 50 victories under their belts, the core cadre, who might have trained the next generation of pilots. Their loss was absolutely catastrophic for Germany's future in the air. Hitler received those casualty reports in his daily military conferences, and witnesses recalled his face turning bright red with rage. "This is sabotage," he shouted, slamming his fist down on the table hard enough to make everyone jump. "The Luftwaffe is betraying the German people." He demanded that Göring explain exactly how the Americans could fly all the way to Berlin and back without effective opposition. Göring, actually present for once, just mumbled something about overwhelming numbers and technical advantages. Hitler cut him off mid-sentence. "Excuses," he spat. "I am surrounded by men who make excuses instead of fighting." What Hitler didn't grasp, or maybe refused to grasp, was that the mathematics of the air war had become literally impossible for Germany to win. By mid-1944, the Americans and British together could put 2,000 heavy bombers over Germany in a single day, protected by over 1,000 escort fighters. Germany was actually producing fighters at a remarkable rate, building over 3,000 per month by the summer of 1944, but production meant absolutely nothing without fuel to fly them or trained pilots to fly them effectively. The training program had collapsed completely under the pressure of losses. New pilots were arriving at frontline units with fewer than 200 hours of flight time, compared to the 400 or 500 hours that Allied pilots received before they ever saw combat. These German kids died in their first or second combat sortie, shot down by experienced Allied pilots before they could even learn basic survival techniques. Galland tried repeatedly to explain this harsh reality to Hitler. In one memorable confrontation in May 1944, he brought charts showing pilot training hours, fuel allocations, and loss rates laid out in brutal clarity. "Mein Führer," he said, "we are sending boys into combat against veterans. We are asking them to fight in aircraft they barely know how to fly. This is not a question of courage or willpower. It is mathematics, pure and simple." Hitler's response was to question Galland's loyalty to the Reich. "You sound like a defeatist, General," he said coldly. "Perhaps you have lost your nerve for combat." Galland, who had flown combat missions throughout the entire war and personally shot down over 100 enemy aircraft, stiffened at the insult but held his tongue. He knew that arguing further would accomplish absolutely nothing. Hitler had decided that the Luftwaffe's failures were moral rather than material, and no amount of evidence, no matter how clear, would change his mind. The fuel situation, more than any other single factor, destroyed German air defenses completely. By late 1944, Allied bombing of synthetic fuel plants had reduced German aviation fuel production to just a tiny fraction of its previous levels. Fighters sat on airfields fully armed and ready to go while their tanks remained completely empty. Pilots who somehow managed to take off had to carefully watch their fuel gauges the entire mission, knowing they might not have enough to reach the bombers and still make it back to base. Training flights became completely impossible. New pilots arrived at squadrons without having practiced formation flying or gunnery because there simply was no fuel available for training exercises. Hitler's solution to the fuel crisis was absolutely typical of his approach to every problem during those final years of the war. He denied its existence, blamed saboteurs and traitors, and demanded that sheer willpower somehow overcome material reality. If there is insufficient fuel, he declared at a conference in September 1944, then the Luftwaffe must fight with what it has. The German soldier has always achieved the impossible through determination and will. When Speer tried to explain that aircraft required fuel the same way soldiers required ammunition, that determination simply could not substitute for petroleum. Hitler accused him of defeatism too. The absurdity of this situation was not lost on ordinary German civilians who watched Allied bombers pass overhead in formations so enormous they took 15 or 20 minutes to pass, while German fighters either didn't appear at all or appeared in such pathetically small numbers that they were clearly ineffective. Joseph Goebbels' diaries from this period record the growing anger and absolute despair in German cities. The people demand to know where the Luftwaffe is, he wrote in October 1944. They see the enemy flying overhead with complete impunity, and they ask why our fighters do not defend them. I have no good answer to give them anymore. Hitler's response to this public anger was to blame Göring even more openly now. In a speech to Nazi party leaders in August 1944, he said the Luftwaffe has disappointed the German people and its leadership has failed them utterly. He stopped just short of naming Göring directly, but absolutely everyone understood exactly who he was talking about. Göring, completely humiliated, withdrew even further from active command of the Air Force. The Luftwaffe effectively had no supreme commander anymore, just Hitler issuing sporadic orders based on hunches and anger rather than any kind of strategic analysis. The whole situation with jet fighters perfectly exemplified Hitler's disastrous interference in air defense. The Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter, entered production in 1944, and it was genuinely revolutionary. It was faster than any Allied aircraft in the sky, capable of over 500 miles per hour, and heavily armed with cannons. In the hands of experienced pilots, it was devastatingly effective against bomber formations, just slashing through them like a shark through a school of fish. Galland and other Luftwaffe commanders saw it as the weapon that might actually restore some balance to the air war. If they could equip several squadrons with jets and concentrate them against specific raids, they might inflict losses severe enough to give the Allies genuine pause. But Hitler had completely different ideas. When he first saw the Me-262 in November 1943, he immediately asked whether it could carry bombs. When told that yes, it could carry a small bomb load, he immediately ordered that it be developed as a bomber rather than as a fighter. This is the aircraft that will strike terror into the hearts of the invading armies, he declared, already thinking ahead to the coming Allied invasion of France. Galland and others tried desperately to explain that the jet's true value lay in its incredible speed and firepower against bombers, that using it as a light bomber was just wasting its revolutionary potential. Hitler absolutely refused to listen. I know what is needed, He said with complete certainty, "The Reich needs bombers, not more fighters." This single decision delayed the Me-262's deployment as a fighter by crucial months. When jets finally entered combat in significant numbers in late 1944, they proved exactly as effective as Galland had predicted they would be. In one encounter over Berlin in March 1945, a formation of just 37 jets attacked American bombers and shot down 12 of them without losing a single jet. But by then it was way too late to matter. There were too few jets, too little fuel to fly them, and too few trained pilots who could handle their tricky characteristics. The wonder weapon that genuinely might have made a real difference arrived when the war was already hopelessly lost. Hitler's reaction to the continued bombing followed a pattern that became grimmer and more detached as the war ground on. After each major raid, he would demand detailed reports, rage at the Luftwaffe's failure, order investigations into sabotage or defeatism, and then just turn his attention to something else. The actual suffering of German civilians seemed to register with him only as an abstraction, as a political problem rather than as a human catastrophe of unimaginable scale. When Dresden burned in February 1945, killing tens of thousands in a firestorm that consumed the city's entire historic center, Hitler's response was to order reprisal attacks against Allied cities. He demanded that the Luftwaffe launch terror raids against London using whatever aircraft still remained. Galland had to explain, probably for the 100th time, that the Luftwaffe no longer had the capability to reach London in any meaningful numbers, that the few bombers still flying were desperately needed to support the army on the Eastern Front against the advancing Soviets. Hitler's response was to question whether Galland was simply a coward. "The British must be made to suffer as our people are suffering," he insisted with absolute conviction. "Find a way to make it happen." No way was found because no way existed anymore. The Luftwaffe that had terrorized all of Europe back in 1940 simply no longer existed. Its veteran pilots were dead, its fuel reserves completely exhausted, its remaining aircraft outnumbered 10-1 by Allied planes. The air defenses that had once exacted such a terrible price from Allied bombers had been overwhelmed by sheer numbers and massive technological superiority. German cities burned night and day now, and Hitler's only response was more rage, more blame, and deeper denial of reality. In the bunker during those final apocalyptic months, Hitler's comments about the Luftwaffe became increasingly divorced from any connection to reality whatsoever. He spoke confidently of secret weapons that would restore air superiority, of jet fighters that existed only in tiny numbers, of miracle fuels that would somehow be produced despite the complete destruction of every single synthetic fuel plant in Germany. He ordered counterattacks by fighter units that had completely ceased to exist, planned elaborate air operations with aircraft that had no fuel, and blamed commanders for failing to achieve things that were literally impossible. Speer, visiting the bunker in March 1945, found Hitler bent over maps of Berlin's air defenses, studying them intently. The maps showed flak batteries and fighter stations marked with all these symbols indicating strength and readiness. But Speer knew the brutal truth behind those neat symbols. Most of those batteries had no ammunition left at all. Most of those fighter stations had no aircraft, or if they did have aircraft, those planes had no fuel to fly. The maps showed what Hitler desperately wanted to exist, not what actually existed in the real world above his head. When Speer very gently suggested that maybe the maps might be a bit out of date, Hitler looked at him with what Speer later described as utter contempt and disgust. "You have lost your faith," Hitler said quietly. "Everyone around me has lost their faith, but I have not lost mine. The German people have not lost theirs. We will prevail because we must prevail, because there is no alternative. Outside the bunker at that very moment, the air raid sirens were wailing again across the ruins of Berlin. American bombers flying in broad daylight passed directly over the city without any opposition whatsoever. The anti-aircraft guns that bothered to fire at them did so more from habit than from any realistic hope of hitting anything. The shells burst far below the bomber formations, creating little black puffs of smoke that the Americans just navigated around with complete ease. In the streets below, Berliners emerged from their shelters to find even more of their city reduced to smoking rubble, more homes destroyed, more neighbors and family members dead under the debris. They looked up at the sky and saw no German fighters at all, only the white contrails of enemy bombers stretching from one horizon to the other like chalk lines across a blackboard. Hitler never once admitted that German air defenses had failed because his strategy had failed, because his constant interference had systematically crippled the Luftwaffe, because his stubborn refusal to face reality had prevented any rational response to the Allied air campaign. In his final testament, dictated in that bunker just days before he took his own life, he blamed the Luftwaffe's leadership, blamed the German people for lacking sufficient willpower, blamed absolutely everyone except himself. The Luftwaffe, he dictated with a steady voice, failed to fulfill its sacred duty to the German nation. Its commanders proved themselves unworthy of the trust that was placed in them. There was no acknowledgement whatsoever that he had placed completely impossible demands on those commanders, no recognition that his decisions had systematically squandered Germany's air defenses, no acceptance of responsibility for the hundreds of thousands of German civilians who died beneath bombs that German fighters could not stop and German flak could not reach. The searchlights still swept the night sky over Berlin on April 30th, 1945, but they illuminated nothing except drifting smoke and falling ash. The anti-aircraft guns were completely silent now, their ammunition exhausted days earlier. The Luftwaffe fighters that might have defended the city were grounded, destroyed, or scattered across Germany with no fuel and no hope of ever flying again. Soviet forces were fighting street by street in the ruins above the bunker where Hitler sat in his final hours. But he spent those last moments still raging about the Luftwaffe's betrayal, about Göring's cowardice, about the failure of German fighters to stop the enemy bombers that had destroyed his 1,000-year Reich. He never understood, or perhaps he never admitted, that the naked skies above German cities were his own creation, the direct result of his decisions, his interference, his absolute refusal to face reality until reality could no longer be denied by anyone. The cities had no air defense left because Hitler had systematically squandered their defenders through years of strategic blunders, impossible demands, and genuinely delusional thinking. His final words on the subject were nothing but accusations and blame, never comprehension, never responsibility, never truth. Above ground, Berlin was burning under Soviet artillery rather than Allied bombs, but the principle was exactly the same. The city was utterly defenseless because its defenses had been destroyed not just by enemy action alone, but by the decisions of the man in that bunker, the man who had once promised with such absolute certainty that no enemy would ever reach the German homeland. That promise, like so many of Hitler's promises to the German people, had dissolved into nothing but ash and rubble and the endless wailing of sirens that warned of attacks that no one could prevent anymore.